The morning Lillian Carver outpaced 3 seasoned cowboys before the sun had fully risen over the Kansas plains. Not a single one of them had the decency to look surprised because by then, they had all stopped being surprised by her. It was the spring of 1878, and the Chisholm Trail still carried the thunder of longhorns north toward the Abilene stockyards, a great living river of cattle that bellowed and churned the earth into red dust. The drive had been organized by a cattle broker named Harold Dunn, a thick-necked man from Wichita who had inherited his father's herd and not 1 ounce of his father's sense. He had hired 11 hands for the drive, and when Lillian Carver had shown up at his corral fence 3 weeks prior with her own horse, her own rope, and a look in her green eyes that dared him to send her away, he had laughed. It was the kind of laugh men gave when they thought something was impossible but didn't want to seem afraid of it. Lillian had not flinched. She had stood there in her late husband's leather chaps, her dark auburn hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her hands resting easy on the top rail of the fence, and she had said, "I have been working cattle since I was 8 years old. My husband and I ran 400 head on our own spread in Comanche County for 6 years. I know this trail better than most of your hired men, and I will do the work of 2 of them for the wage of 1. You can say no, Mr. Dunn, but you would be making the single stupidest business decision of your life." Harold Dunn had hired her, mostly because his regular cook had come down with a fever and backed out, and he'd thought perhaps she could cook instead. He had been wrong about that too. Lillian could cook, but she had no intention of spending the drive at a chuck wagon while the real work happened on horseback. She had taken the position of a trail hand, and within the first week, she had proven herself so thoroughly that even the most stubborn of the hired men had stopped making remarks under their breath. Her husband, Thomas Carver, had died 14 months before the drive. A fever had taken him in the winter of 1877, the kind of slow, merciless illness that seemed designed to strip a strong man down to nothing before it finally finished him. Thomas had been 31 years old, and Lillian had been 28, and they had built their small ranch together from raw ground and borrowed money, and the kind of stubborn love that doesn't ask whether things are fair. When he died, Lillian had buried him under the big cottonwood at the eastern edge of their property, sold the ranch to pay his debts, and spent the following months working wherever work could be found, because grief was a luxury she could not afford. She was 30 now, lean and capable, and carrying a weight behind her eyes that people sometimes mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was simply the particular stillness of a person who had learned that the world did not pause for mourning. The 11 other hired hands on Harold Dunn's drive included men of varying quality. There was Bobby Crane, who was 22 and cheerful and good with a rope, but had a habit of sleeping past dawn. There was Walt Emmett, who was 40 and experienced and spoke about every third sentence. There were the Harlow brothers, Cal and Jesse, who were both competent enough but spent most of their idle time in low-grade argument with each other. And there was a man called Decker, whose first name nobody seemed to know, who was the strongest roper on the drive and who had taken Lillian's presence with a particular quiet hostility that he expressed primarily through silence and the deliberate refusal to pass things to her at the campfire. Lillian did not waste energy on Decker. She had met men like him before, men whose sense of their own worth depended on a very specific and fragile ordering of the world, and she had long since stopped trying to rearrange herself to fit around their discomfort. She did her work, and her work spoke loudly enough. The herd numbered 840 longhorns, and they were moving them from a staging ground south of Caldwell, Kansas, northward along the established trail to Abilene, a journey of roughly 150 miles that would take the better part of 3 weeks in decent conditions. The spring had been wet, which meant the ground was soft and the river crossings would be harder than usual, but it also meant the grass was good and the cattle were strong and full. On the morning of the 4th day out from Caldwell, the herd spooked. It happened just before dawn, in that deep blue hour when the sky is still deciding what color to become. Something in the grass, a coyote, most likely, or possibly a jackrabbit moving wrong, hit the nerves of the lead steers, and before anyone fully understood what was happening, 840 longhorns were running. A cattle stampede in the dark is one of the most terrifying things the open plains can produce. The sound of it is not just loud, it is physical, a vibration that moves up through the ground and into the bones, and the dust rises even in darkness like a visible panic. The hands who were on night watch screamed warnings, and the camp exploded into motion, men scrambling for horses, Harold Dunn shouting something that nobody could hear over the roar of hooves. Lillian was already on her horse. She had slept lightly, the way she always did, and she had heard the first deep tremor in the earth before anyone else had registered it as trouble. Her mare, a dun-colored quarter horse she called Sage, was tethered close, and Lillian had her saddled and was moving before most of the camp was fully awake. She rode hard to the eastern flank of the stampede, where the herd was beginning to curve and scatter, and she did the thing that experienced hands did in a stampede, which was to find the lead animals and push them into a wide, turning circle, bleeding the speed out of the run by tightening the arc until the cattle were circling themselves into confusion, and then into exhaustion, and then, finally, into something resembling stillness. Bobby Crane reached her side eventually, and then Walt Emmett, and together they worked the herd for nearly 2 hours in the dark and the dust before the animals settled. When the sun finally rose and the dust count was done, they had lost 11 head, which had broken away in the darkness, and could not be recovered without adding a full day to the drive, a loss Harold Dunn would absorb with clenched teeth, and no words of gratitude to the hands who had saved the rest. It was Bobby Crane who said, during the breakfast that followed, "I have never seen anyone move that fast in the dark. I didn't even know where I was, and you were already out there turning them." Lillian poured her coffee and said, "Thomas always said the first 30 seconds of a stampede are the only 30 seconds that matter. Everything after that is just managing what you didn't do in those first 30. There was a quiet around the fire that was not uncomfortable. "Your husband sounds like he knew his cattle," Walt Emmett said. "He knew everything worth knowing," Lillian said, and the way she said it closed the subject gently but completely. The days that followed were long and physical, and filled with the particular demands that a cattle drive made on the body and the spirit. Lillian rode the flanks and the drag and the point as needed, switching positions without complaint, doing whatever the moment required. She could mend a broken harness in 15 minutes. She could read weather in the color of the western sky. She knew when a steer was about to break from the herd before the steer itself seemed to know it, some combination of instinct and experience that could not be taught, only accumulated. The other hands watched her, and most of them, even the ones who had initially been skeptical, began to calibrate themselves differently around her. Not because she demanded it, but because competence has a kind of gravity, and after enough days on the trail, what a person could do mattered considerably more than what they were supposed to be. Decker remained the exception. On the 9th day of the drive, the herd needed to cross the Nineska River, which was running higher than usual from the spring rains, and Harold Dunn put Decker in charge of organizing the crossing. Decker assigned Lillian to hold the remuda, the spare horses back from the crossing point, a task that was important but was clearly the least demanding assignment in the operation, and there was a pointed quality to the assignment that everyone noticed. Lillian took the remuda position without argument, but when 3 steers broke from the crossing and turned upstream, moving fast through the rushing water, it was the remuda position that put her closest to the break, and she pushed Sage into the river without hesitation, riding hard through the current to cut the steers off before they could gain the far bank and scatter into the brush beyond. The water came up to Sage's belly, and the current pulled sideways and hard, but Lillian rode low and forward and found the angle, and she turned those 3 steers back into the main herd before Decker had even finished shouting orders about who should go after them. She came out of the river soaking wet and already thinking about the next problem, and she did not look at Decker at all. It was Cal Harlow who told the story at camp that night, embellishing it considerably in ways that made Lillian uncomfortable, but she let it go because Cal was fundamentally harmless, and the story made the newer hands feel better about the crossing, and morale on a long drive was its own kind of currency. The drive had been going 11 days when Peter Yates found them. He appeared on the eastern horizon in the early afternoon of a Wednesday, a single rider moving at an easy lope across the grass, and the hands who spotted him called out in the habitual way of trail people, a mix of greeting and assessment that was both hospitable and watchful. Strangers on the open plains in 1878 could be a great many things, most of them neutral, some of them problematic, and the habit of reading a rider before he arrived was not paranoia but simple practicality. He was riding a big gray gelding, the kind of horse that cost real money, and he sat it the way men sat horses when riding was as natural as breathing. He was wearing a dark brown trail coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather, and as he drew closer Lillian could see that he was perhaps 34 or 35, with a straight back and a face that was weathered without being hard, a distinction she had learned to make. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and brown eyes that caught the afternoon light in a way that made them appear amber. He introduced himself to Harold Dunn first, as courtesy required, and Lillian watched the exchange from 30 yards away while she recoiled a rope that had gotten tangled in the morning's work. She could not hear the words, but she could read the body language. Dunn was doing his elaborate, chest-forward performance of authority, and the stranger was listening with the particular patience of a man who was waiting for the relevant information to emerge from the irrelevant. His name, she learned at the supper fire that night, was Peter Yates. He ran a ranch east of the drive's path, near a settlement called Cedar Creek, and he had been riding westward to assess the condition of a water source on the far side of the trail when he had come across them. Harold Dunn had invited him to ride along for a day or two, a common enough courtesy on the trail, where company was valued and an extra capable rider was always quietly welcome. Peter Yates sat across the fire from Lillian that first evening and said very little, but she noticed that his silence was a listening silence rather than a withdrawn one. He watched the hands interact with each other and with the cattle, and he asked occasional questions of Walt Emmett, who was the oldest and most experienced of the hired men, and his questions were the questions of a man who genuinely worked cattle rather than the questions of someone performing interest. He ate without complaint about the food, which was a mark in his favor because the drive's cook, a young man from Missouri named Eli who had gotten the job because he was Dunn's nephew, was not a gifted practitioner of his art. Lillian did not speak to Peter Yates that first evening, and he did not speak to her, but she was aware of him in the way she was aware of changing weather, a background presence that registered without demanding attention. On the second morning, he helped move the herd through a section of broken ground, where a dry creek bed had created a series of small drops that the cattle were reluctant to cross. He worked without instruction, reading the situation and responding to it, and he handled his gray gelding with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years on horseback. Lillian worked the opposite side of the problem, and they resolved it together in about 20 minutes without exchanging a word. At the midday rest, he rode up beside her where she had stopped to let Sage drink from a shallow run of water. "That left flank maneuver you used this morning," he said, "with the drop crossing. Where did you learn that?" Lillian looked at him. "Experience," she said. "That's where all the best things come from," he said, and there was no flattery in it, just a simple observation, the kind a person made when they were being honest rather than charming. "My husband and I drove cattle in Comanche County for years," she said. "You learn what works." There was a brief pause, and she knew he had heard the past tense of my husband and was calibrating the way people did. "Peter Yates," he said, extending his hand. "Lillian Carver," she said, and shook it. His grip was firm without performance, and he released her hand after a single clean shake. "How much further to Abilene?" he asked. "8 days if the weather holds," she said. 6 if Eli stops burning the coffee and the hands sleep better. He smiled at that, a real smile, brief and unguarded, and she looked away toward the herd before it could develop into something she'd have to respond to. That evening at camp, Bobby Crane fell off his horse in the most spectacular fashion, dismounting at the wrong angle on a small slope and going end over end with a shout that startled the horses and caused the Harlow brothers to collapse into laughter. He was unhurt but thoroughly muddy, and the whole camp was lighter for 20 minutes afterward, that particular quality of hilarity that comes from a mishap with no consequence. Lillian laughed too, genuinely, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and when she looked up from her laughter she found Peter Yates watching her with an expression she did not immediately have a name for. She looked back at Bobby Crane crawling out of the mud to general applause and let the laughter finish itself. The next morning, the weather that had been holding broke, and the sky turned the color of a bruise and the wind came from the north with a cold weight that meant business. Harold Dunn made the decision to keep moving, partly because stopping cost money and partly because he was not a man who liked acknowledging that nature had opinions about his schedule. The hands moved the herd forward into the rising wind, and by early afternoon the rain had arrived, a hard, driving rain that reduced visibility to 50 yards and turned the ground to slick clay. Working cattle in the rain was miserable in ways that were difficult to explain to people who had not done it. The animals became fractious and stupid, their instincts crosswired by the discomfort, and they required constant pressure from the flanks to maintain any semblance of direction. The ground was treacherous, and the horses had to work twice as hard to cover the same distance, and everything that could become cold did become cold, and the cold settled into the hands and the backs and the places between the shoulders with a determined thoroughness. Lillian worked through it without complaint. She adjusted her seat on sage to compensate for the slippery ground, kept her rope ready, and moved up and down the line as needed. Her hat channeled water down the back of her neck in a steady stream and her gloves were soaked through, but she kept moving, kept watching, kept the cattle straight. It was in the middle of the 3rd hour of rain that the section of herd near the rear began to drift west. The hands at the drag position, Jesse Harlow and a young man named Clement who was on his first drive, were struggling to hold the line in the reduced visibility, and the drift was slow enough that it might have gone unnoticed until it became a problem. Lillian saw it first. She turned sage and rode hard along the length of the herd to the drag, arriving to find Jesse Harlow shouting at Clement and Clement looking panicked, and she did not stop to adjudicate the argument. She rode wide around the drifting cattle and began the work of pushing them back to the line, using Sage's body to block and redirect, reading the lead animals of the drifted group and applying pressure in exactly the right place and degree. Peter Yates appeared out of the rain on the far side of the drift, having seen the problem from his position, and he took the other angle without needing to be told, and together they worked the drifted cattle back into the main line with a neatness that seemed almost too tidy for the conditions. When it was done, they sat their horses side by side for a moment in the rain, and he looked at her and said, "You never stop." "Neither do you," she said. "I notice things," he said simply. She looked at him steadily, rain running off the brim of her hat. "What do you notice?" "That you're the best hand on this drive," he said, "and that everyone here knows it, including Dunn, though he'll never say it." "Dunn doesn't need to say it," she said. "The cattle get north, that's enough." He looked at her for a long moment, and there was something careful and intent in his expression. "You always think in those terms. What's enough?" "It keeps things simple," she said, and she turned Sage back toward the main herd, not because she wanted the conversation to end, but because it was beginning to be the kind of conversation that required more stillness than a cattle drive in the rain could provide. That night, sheltering under a stretched canvas tarp that Eli had managed to rig, before his cooking duties consumed all his attention, The hands sat close together in the way cold and misery made inevitable, and the conversation meandered through the usual territory of trail talk, complaints about pay and weather, and the disposition of specific steers, small stories from previous drives, the slow geography of who had been where and done what in the years before this particular stretch of plains. Peter Yates sat at the edge of the group, and Lillian sat at the other edge, and across the space between them she was aware of him the way she had been aware of weather all her life, a persistent, detailed awareness that she could not quite decide what to do with. Walt Emmett, who spoke rarely but usually well, said at some point during the evening, "Worst crossing I ever made was the Red River in '73. Lost 4 men and about 60 head. River was up so high you couldn't see the far bank." There was a respectful silence. "I was on the Red in '73, Peter Yates said quietly. "Different outfit, different section, but I remember that water. You been on the trail long?" Bobby Crane asked. "Started when I was 19, Peter said. Did 6 years of drives before I put money into land. Got my own spread now east of here, about 3,000 acres, running around 400 head most years, give or take." "You run it alone?" Bobby asked. 4 permanent hands, hire seasonal when I need to." He paused. "Been looking for a 5th permanent hand for 2 years. Haven't found the right fit." Lillian was looking at the rain running off the edge of the tarp, and she did not say anything, but she felt the direction of his words the way you felt the direction of wind. The next day brought clearing skies and a cold brightness that made the world look newly made, and the mood of the whole drive lifted with the weather. The cattle moved well, the ground was firming up, and Eli managed to produce a breakfast that was almost good. Lillian worked the morning along the west flank, moving at an easy trot, and she was in that particular state that hard physical work sometimes produced, a state of clean, uncomplicated presence where the body was fully occupied and the mind moved lightly, not thinking so much as observing. She watched a hawk work the grassland ahead of the herd, circling in long, patient loops, and she thought about Thomas, which she did every day, in the habitual way that grief eventually becomes. Not a wound but a presence, always there, changed in quality from the sharp, impossible pain of the early days to something more like the steady weight of a stone you carry in your chest, familiar enough that you have learned to breathe around it. She had loved Thomas Carver with the full force of what she was, and losing him had felt like losing a primary direction, the way you might lose north on a compass, still able to function but fundamentally disoriented in ways that were hard to explain. The 14 months since had been about learning to find direction on her own terms, and she had made progress, but progress was not the same as completion, and she knew it. She was not thinking about Peter Yates, or she was thinking about the fact that she was trying not to think about him, which amounted to the same thing. He rode up beside her mid-morning, his gray gelding falling easily into step with Sage, and for a while they just rode together in a comfortable silence that felt neither awkward nor charged. "How much further is your ranch?" she asked eventually, because she needed to know how many days this would last, this side-by-side business. "I'll turn east tomorrow afternoon," he said. "Cedar Creek is about 20 miles that way." "Long way from home for water assessment," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't entirely here for water assessment." She glanced at him. "What were you here for?" "I heard Dunn was running a drive this season. Heard he'd hired a woman hand who turned 3 steers in a river crossing and stopped a stampede in the dark before dawn." He paused. "I wanted to see if it was true." Lillian was quiet for a long moment, watching the cattle ahead of them move in their slow, purposeful way. "And," she said, "everything I heard was understated," he said. "Who did you hear it from?" "Man in Caldwell. Said he'd been at the staging ground when the drive set out. Said there was a woman hired on who had a look about her like she'd done everything twice already." Lillian made a sound that was almost a laugh. "A look about her," she repeated. "His words," Peter said, "but he wasn't wrong." She looked at him directly. "Why does it matter to you whether a woman can work cattle or not?" He met her gaze without flinching. Because I need someone who can work cattle on my ranch. Not someone who can approximate it or manage it passively. Someone who genuinely can. And you thought that might be me. I thought it was worth finding out, he said. He held her gaze. I'm not disappointed. Lillian turned away, looking forward along the line of the herd. The hawk was still out there, still circling, patient and precise. I don't know what I'm doing after this drive, she said honestly. That's useful information, he said. What have you been doing before it? She gave him the short version. Thomas, the ranch, the debts, the selling, the past 14 months of seasonal work wherever she could find it. She told it without drama, in the factual way she had learned to tell it, and he listened the way he listened to everything, with full attention, and without the particular discomfort that men sometimes showed when a woman described hard things plainly. When she finished, he said, I'm sorry about your husband. Thank you, she said. It was the first time in a long time that those 3 words from a stranger had not felt either insufficient or excessive. He had said it at exactly the right weight. The offer stands, he said. Permanent hand, fair wage, good land, decent outfit. You'd have your own quarters and your own authority over whatever section of the operation we agreed on. You're offering me a job based on 2 days of watching me work a cattle drive, she said. I'm offering you a job based on the clearest read of a hand I've had in years, he said. 2 days or 20, I know what I'm seeing. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, I'll think about it, and he nodded as if that were a reasonable and sufficient answer, and they rode together in silence for another mile before the herd demanded their attention in opposite directions and they separated. That evening, she sat apart from the camp for a while after supper, in the way she sometimes did, needing the quiet and the dark and the open sky above the plains. The stars were exceptional, the way they always were this far from anywhere. A deep and serious abundance of light that made the world feel both enormous and intimate. She found the shapes she knew, the dipper, the belt, the bright particular star that Thomas had always called her star, though she had never learned its proper name, and she sat with them for a while. She was not ready to stop missing Thomas. She did not think she would ever stop missing Thomas, and she did not think she was supposed to. But missing someone and closing yourself to the world were different things, and she had known Thomas well enough to know that he would have held the second thing against her. He had been a man of large generosity, and he had never in his life thought that his importance to her should prevent her from being fully alive. She thought about that for a long time. Peter Yates came and sat a few yards away from her, not too close, and he looked at the same sky without speaking for a considerable stretch of time. Tell me about your ranch, she said eventually, and he told her. He told her about the land east of Cedar Creek, the way the hills rolled in a particular gentle way that made the horizon seem always just a little further than it was. He told her about the creek that ran along the southern edge, and the cottonwood grove near the eastern boundary, where he had once found an old campsite that must have been years older than the settlement. He told her about the 4 hands he employed, men he trusted, and who had been with him long enough to know the place as well as he did. He told her about the cattle, a mixed herd of Longhorn and some of the new Durham crosses that were coming into fashion, heavier animals that didn't travel as well but produced better at market. He told her about the winters, which were hard, and the springs, which were worth the winters. He told her about his sister, who lived in Wichita with her husband and their 3 children, and how he rode to see them twice a year, and felt the shape of their family life like something good and slightly foreign. He told her about his parents, both gone now, his father from a horse accident when Peter was 27 and his mother from illness 2 years after. He told her these things in the quiet, unself-conscious way of someone who was not trying to impress her, but simply answering what she had asked. And Lillian listened and built a picture from the telling, not of a man who was perfect or without history, but of a man who was real, whole, capable of tenderness, and honest about hardship. "Why haven't you married?" she asked, because she was direct in the way that grief made you direct. He was quiet for a moment. There was a woman in Wichita 8 years ago. We were serious for a time, but she wanted to stay in town and I could not make myself be a town man. We parted without bitterness, but we parted." He paused. "After that I put everything into the land for a long time, and when I came back up for air I was 33 and the ranch was something I was proud of, but I was doing it alone, and that was—" He searched for the word. "That was a thing I noticed," he said. "Lonely," she said. "Yes," he said, with the simplicity of someone who had accepted the truth of a word. They sat in the dark for a while longer, and when Lillian finally stood to go back to her bedroll, he stood too, and they walked back toward the low glow of the campfire together without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. The final days of the drive were a combination of hard work and growing familiarity among the hands, the way the end of a difficult shared effort produces a warmth that can almost feel like affection. Bobby Crane had decided that Lillian was his favorite person on the drive, and demonstrated this by telling her everything that occurred to him, a quality she bore with more patience than she had expected. Walt Emmett had begun deferring to her judgment on herd matters in a quiet way that she found both flattering and appropriate. Even the Harlow brothers, Cal and Jesse, had settled into a comfortable working relationship with her, their initial skepticism long since dissolved by the evidence. Decker remained the exception, but even his hostility had diminished to something closer to sullenness, and on the 16th day of the drive, he had watched her diagnose a lame steer correctly, identifying a stone bruise, rather than the tendon problem he had insisted on, and she had seen something shift in his expression that was not quite respect, but was at least the predecessor of it. Peter Yates was supposed to turn east on the afternoon of the 12th day. He did not. He said, when Lillian raised an eyebrow at his continued presence, that the water assessment could wait another few days, which they both understood was not really about water assessment, and she let it pass without comment. He rode beside her more now, openly, without the self-consciousness of the early days, and they talked the way people talk when they have discovered that conversation is one of the better things the world has to offer, and the other person is good at it. They talked about cattle and land and weather, and the particular technical challenges of the current drive. They talked about what they had read. Both of them had books, which the other hands found quietly eccentric, and Peter mentioned a copy of Twain he had in his saddlebag, which Lillian borrowed and returned with 3 observations about it that made him look at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize and still hadn't entirely named. He told her things about himself that were not the polished versions men presented in early conversations, but the less finished truths of someone who had decided that honesty was simpler than its alternative. He told her that he was better with cattle than he was with people, in general, though there were exceptions. He told her that he sometimes woke in the night worried about the ranch in ways that were not entirely rational. He told her that he had a temper he worked to control, that it came from his father, and that he had spent 20 years learning to feel it arrive and choose what to do before it chose for him. Lillian told him things in return, and found that telling them felt different than it usually did, less like reporting and more like sharing, the way you shared a fire rather than just occupying the same warmth. On the 18th day of the drive, they crossed a wide, shallow section of the Arkansas River, and it was an easier crossing than the Nineska had been, the water low and the bottom firm, and the herd moved through it with relative grace. Afterward, the hands rested at the bank and let the cattle spread and graze on the good grass, and there was a feeling in the air of the drive winding toward its conclusion, the particular quality of almost done that both lightens and, strangely, saddens. Lillian sat at the bank with her boots off and her feet in the cold water, which was a luxury she permitted herself rarely, and Peter Yates sat beside her doing the same, and for a long time neither of them said anything, watching the river move, watching the cattle graze, watching the sky go through its afternoon business. "Have you thought more about the offer?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "And," she was quiet for a moment, "tell me why you really want someone with my particular set of skills." Because you said it at the start, you could hire a good hand from anywhere. There are plenty of capable men who ride this trail every season. He looked at the river. There are, he said. And I have hired capable men. Good men, most of them. But there is a way of seeing a piece of land that goes beyond technique. A way of understanding what it needs before it tells you, of knowing the difference between what the animals are doing and what they're about to do. It's not teachable. It's either in a person or it isn't. And you have it in a degree I have not seen in years. He paused. Also, if I am being honest, which I have found tends to be the most efficient policy, I have spent the last week finding every excuse not to ride east, and I suspect that is only partly about the quality of your horsemanship. Lillian looked at her feet in the cold water. The river made its constant, indifferent sound around them. Peter, she said, yes. I am still, she stopped, chose her words carefully. I am still carrying something, I want you to know that. I know that, he said simply. I am not asking you to put it down. I am just asking whether there is room alongside it for other things. She looked at him. His face was serious and open, and she could see in it that he was not asking her for anything false, was not requiring her to perform a recovery she hadn't made or to pretend that Thomas Carver had not been the love of the first part of her life. There might be, she said slowly. I think there might be. He nodded, and she saw the careful, measured quality of his relief, and it told her a great deal about him that it was measured, that he did not reach or push or assume. Then come to Cedar Creek, he said. Come see the land. If it suits you and the work suits you and the people suit you, then we'll talk about what it means. And if none of those things are true, then I'll ride you to Abilene and call it a favor freely given, he said, and his voice was steady. She thought about it for a long moment, the river running past her feet, the cattle grazing behind them, the late afternoon light gold on the grass. All right, she said. I'll come to Cedar Creek. The smile that crossed his face then was not the brief, restrained smile she had seen in the early days. It was a full thing, arriving from somewhere genuine and honest, and it changed his whole face. And Lillian Carver, who had been trying very hard not to feel something specific, felt it anyway and decided, carefully, that she was not sorry. They reached the outskirts of Abilene on the 20th day, and the stockyards that greeted them were everything a cattle drive aimed at. Pens and scales and the great, busy, commercial machinery of the beef trade. Buyers moving through the pens, prices being discussed and argued and eventually settled. Harold Dunn took possession of his 829 surviving head with the expression of a man who was calculating profit margins in his head, and he paid the hands their wages in the dusty office of the stockyard agent with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose gratitude was functionally indistinguishable from its absence. He gave Lillian her wage and did not look at her, and she folded the money into her vest pocket and walked out into the sunlight of Abilene without looking back. Bobby Crane caught her outside and shook her hand with considerable feeling. Best hand I ever rode with, he said, and I mean that entirely, and I don't say things I don't mean. You say a great many things, she said with warmth. Most of them are true, he said cheerfully, and then he was off toward the nearest saloon with the single-mindedness of a man who had been on the trail for 20 days. Walt Emmett shook her hand too and said nothing, which from him was the equivalent of a speech. Cal Harlow said that if she was ever looking for work in the Texas Panhandle, she should look up their cousin Fletcher. And Jessie Harlow said Fletcher was insufferable and she should do no such thing. And they were arguing about it as they walked away, which was how she had known them and how she expected they would always be. Decker stopped in front of her, and she expected nothing and was prepared for nothing. And he looked at her for a moment with his difficult, weathered face and said, "You're a good hand." And then he walked away, and she understood that from him those 4 words cost more than most men's speeches, and she received them accordingly. Peter Yates was waiting with the horses outside the stockyard gate, Sage saddled and ready beside his gray gelding, and the sight of him standing there in the afternoon light of Abilene patient as he always was, did something to the arrangement of things inside her chest. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said, and she took Sage's reins and mounted, and they rode east out of Abilene together into the long, golden, wide-open afternoon. The ride to Cedar Creek took 2 days, and those 2 days were among the most vivid of Lillian's recent memory, not because of anything dramatic that happened, but because of the quality of presence they shared. They rode through country that opened and rolled and showed itself in long, unhurried perspectives, and they talked and were silent in equal measure, and she felt the specific pleasure of being in the company of someone whose intelligence she respected and whose presence did not exhaust her. Peter pointed out landmarks and told her their stories. The draw where he had found a dozen wild mustangs in his first winter on the land, a geological feature in a hillside that he had never been able to explain but that he found beautiful, the particular grove of oaks near a creek crossing that turned an improbable gold in autumn. He told her these things with a quiet pride that was clearly love, the love of a man for the specific land he had made his life on, and Lillian listened and understood it because she had felt it once too, for the place in Comanche County that was no longer hers. They camped one night between Abilene and Cedar Creek, and it was an easy camp, efficient and comfortable, and they talked late into the evening beside a small fire. And at some point the talking became quieter and more personal, and she told him about the early years of her marriage to Thomas, about the way they had built the ranch piece by piece, about the winter of Thomas's illness, about the specific shape of the grief that had followed. She told it without performance, and he received it without attempting to fix it or minimize it or redirect it, and when she finished there was a silence that was full rather than empty. "He sounds like a man worth missing," Peter said quietly. "He was," she said. "He is." "Good," Peter said, and she understood what he meant, that he was not threatened by Thomas's memory and was not asking her to be finished with it, only asking, as he had said at the river, whether there was room alongside it. She looked at him across the fire, this man she had known for less than 2 weeks, and she thought about the strange economy of time on the trail, how days in motion together accumulate into a kind of intimacy that months in ordinary circumstances might not produce. "You should know," she said, "that I am not easy company. I am opinionated. I will argue with you about ranch decisions. I do not soften things for the sake of avoiding friction." "I know all of that," he said, with a straightforwardness that startled a laugh out of her. "You do. I have watched you work for 12 days, he said. "I know exactly what you are. And you're still here," he said simply, "still riding east." She looked at the fire for a moment and then back at him. "So am I," she said, and it meant more than the direction of travel, and they both knew it. Cedar Creek Ranch was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. It was larger than his descriptions had made it, not in the ostentatious way of men who built big to compensate for other lacks, but in the solid, purposeful way of land that had been developed with genuine intention. The main house was a 2-story structure of good timber with a covered porch that faced west toward the hills, and the outbuildings were well maintained and arranged with the practical logic of someone who had thought carefully about how a working operation should flow. There was a barn that smelled of good hay and horses, a bunkhouse where the 4 permanent hands lived, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that was just beginning to come up in the spring warmth, and through the eastern fence line the cattle were visible at pasture, a good-sized herd in obvious health. The 4 hands came out to meet them. A man named Hank Delroy, who was 50 and had been with Peter for 7 years, and who greeted Lillian with a considered nod that she read as cautious approval. A man named Davis Worth, who was 38, and who had a quick intelligence about him and a comfortable way of moving that suggested long experience. 2 brothers named Sam and George Finley, who were younger, mid-20s, and who had clearly been briefed on her arrival, and were trying to manage their curiosity with varying degrees of success. Lillian shook each hand and assessed each man in the quick, accurate way the trail had taught her, and she found nothing that made her want to leave. Peter showed her the ranch over the course of the first 2 days, taking her through every section of the operation with the thoroughness of someone who was showing something he was proud of and wanted her to understand fully. He showed her the water sources and the fence lines and the grazing rotations and the small operation of a forge and repair workshop that Hank ran for maintaining equipment. He showed her the books, which were orderly and clear, and explained his approach to seasonal hiring and market timing and herd management. And he listened to everything she said in response, which was considerable, because she had opinions about all of it, observations and suggestions and questions that arose from her own experience and from her genuine engagement with the details of what she was seeing. On the third day, he asked her to work alongside Davis Worth for the morning, helping move a group of young steers from one pasture to another, and she did so with the ease of long practice. And Davis Worth, who had been skeptical in a quiet professional way, came back to the barn at midday and said to Peter, in a tone that clearly did not expect to be overheard, "She's better than she is, if that makes any sense." Lillian heard it from the far side of the barn door and chose to take it as the compliment it was rather than interrogate its grammar. In the evenings she stayed in the guest room of the main house, a clean and simply furnished room with a window that looked east toward a line of low hills, and she sat by that window sometimes in the late evening and thought about the question of what she was doing here and what she was willing to allow herself to want. The grief for Thomas was still present, as she had known it would be, but she had been honest with herself for long enough to know the difference between grief and punishment, between carrying love for someone and using that love as a reason not to live fully. Thomas had never asked her to diminish herself. Not once in 6 years had he asked her to be less than what she was. She did not think he would ask it now. On the 5th day at Cedar Creek, Peter asked her in the evening if she would like to ride the eastern boundary with him, and she said yes, and they rode out in the long, slow light of a spring evening across grass that was green and full, and the hills in the distance were soft with new growth, and the sky was the particular blue of deep spring, saturated and clear. They stopped at the boundary fence looking east, and he said, "What do you think?" "I think it's good land," she said. "That's not all I'm asking," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the hills, not at her, giving her the space of his attention without the pressure of his gaze. "I know," she said. A moment passed. "I think I would like to stay," she said, "if the offer stands." He turned and looked at her then, and in his eyes was that careful, genuine quality that she had come to trust, the look of a man who meant what he felt and did not dress it up or perform it. "The offer stands," he said, "more than stands." Which part of it, she asked, because she needed to be clear, because she was the kind of person who needed to be clear. "All of it," he said. "The work and the wages and—" He paused, chose his words. "And whatever else you wanted to include." Lillian looked at the hills for a moment, and then she said, "I need time, Peter. Not a long time, but time. To be here and know the place and be sure." "Take whatever time you need," he said, without hesitation. "You're very patient," she said. "I have found that most things worth having require it," he said. She looked at him, at this patient, honest, capable man who had ridden 12 days out of his way on a cattle drive on the strength of a rumor that turned out to be true, and who had offered her work and a future and the space to find her own way to them, and she thought that Thomas would have liked him, and the thought was unexpected and not unkind. "All right," she said. "Then I'll stay." They rode back to the ranch in the dark, and it was a comfortable dark, the stars beginning their nightly appearance, and the horses moved in the easy, familiar way of animals returning home. The weeks that followed were the best kind of busy, the kind where the work is real, and the people around you are capable, and the land responds to what you put into it. Lillian threw herself into the operation of Cedar Creek Ranch with the full force of her ability, and it was considerable, and its effect on the operation was rapid and visible. She reorganized the grazing rotations based on what she had learned in her years on the Comanche County spread, reducing overgrazing in the southern pastures that she identified as stressed. She caught a sickness, moving through part of the herd early enough that Peter's losses were minimal. She established a working relationship with each of the four hands that was professional and warm in the precise degrees that each of them required. Hank Delray, the oldest and most senior of the hands, was the last to fully come around, not because he was hostile but because he was careful. And his caution about Lillian was not about her being a woman, but about her being new, which she respected. She earned his confidence slowly and deliberately, by asking his opinion on decisions where his long knowledge of the place was genuinely valuable, and by demonstrating consistently that her judgment could be trusted. And one morning in the 6th week, she found him at the barn before dawn, already beginning the tasks she had outlined the previous evening without being asked, and she understood that he had made his decision. She and Peter moved around each other in the way of people who were aware of something building between them, but not rushing toward it. There were evenings on the porch after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, talking over the day's work and the week's plans, conversations that ranged from the practical to the personal, in a way that felt natural and unhurried. There were mornings when they rode the land together, checking fence and water and stock, and those mornings had a quality she could only describe as rightness, a fit of temperament and purpose that she did not think she had any right to expect, but that she was not going to pretend she couldn't feel. One evening in the 8th week, there was a storm that moved through with real force, not dangerous in itself but loud and close, and the horses were restless in the barn, and she and Peter spent 2 hours in the barn keeping them calm, standing in the warm hay smell and the sound of rain on the roof. And at some point in the 2nd hour she became aware that they were standing quite close to each other and had been for some time, and that neither of them had moved to increase the distance. She looked at him in the lamplight. He said very quietly, "I would like to kiss you, Lillian." And she said equally quietly, "I know. Is that a yes?" He asked with a seriousness and a care that moved her. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." It was not a desperate kiss or a dramatic kiss. It was the kind of kiss that two careful people give each other when they have both thought for a long time about whether it was the right thing and arrived at their respective conclusions and are finally, quietly, acting on them. It was warm and real and entirely itself, and when it ended they stood there in the barn with the rain on the roof and the horses quieting around them, and Lillian felt something in her chest shift and resettle into a new arrangement that was still carrying the weight it had always carried but was carrying it differently, more balanced somehow, as if it had been redistributed over a larger frame. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he agreed, with a small smile. They walked back to the house through the rain that had become lighter, and at the door of the house they paused and she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was a kind of simple joy in the looking that she had not felt in a very long time, and that she allowed herself fully, without qualification. In the weeks following, the natural movement of things between them was unhurried but clear in its direction. Peter Yates was not a man who did things without intention, and his intention was unmistakable, expressed not in grand gestures, but in the accumulated small evidence of a man who was fully paying attention. The way he saved the 2nd cup of coffee when she was out early and hadn't gotten the first one, the way he listened to her observations about the operation, and the way she could see him weighing them seriously before responding, the way he always knew where she was on the land without making it surveillance, an awareness born of genuine interest rather than oversight. She brought him the same quality of attention. She noticed when the weight of the ranch's management sat on him differently, when the small worries that came with any working operation gathered and needed talking through, and she was the person he talked through them with now, and she was good at it, clear-headed and honest, and able to separate what was real concern from what was the inevitable ambient worry of someone who cared about what they had built. There was an afternoon in the 10th week when 2 men rode onto the property who had the look and manner of trouble, men whose horses were tired from hard riding, and whose eyes moved over the ranch with an assessing quality that had nothing to do with admiring the land. Peter met them at the gate and spoke with them, and Lillian watched from the corral fence and kept Hank Delroy apprised of her read on the situation. And between them they had Davis Worth and the Finley brothers positioned at various points of vantage without anything dramatic happening. The men were apparently looking for a man they claimed was a debtor, and they gave a description that did not match anyone at Cedar Creek. And after a conversation that was entirely civil and somewhat tense, they rode on. That evening Peter told her the full story, that the man they were looking for was a former hand he had let go 2 seasons back for dishonesty, a man who had drifted south and evidently gotten himself into debt with the wrong people, and he was honestly relieved that the situation had resolved without complication. "You were ready," he said, meaning the positioning of the hands, meaning the quiet, effective response to the situation. "It seemed like a reasonable precaution," she said. "You read it perfectly," he said. "So did you," she said. "You didn't push anything, you let it stay civil." "Most things stay civil if you give them room to," he said. "Not all things, but most." This was one of the things she found she loved about him, that specific wisdom, the knowledge of when to hold ground and when to give space, and the ability to tell the difference. It was wisdom she recognized because it matched her own hard-won experience, and finding it in someone else was one of the unexpected pleasures of being known. She had not used that word to herself before, the word love, but she was using it now, quietly and without ceremony, in the private accounting of what she felt, and she found that using it did not frighten her the way she had expected it might. 12 weeks after she had arrived at Cedar Creek, on a warm evening in July when the light was doing its best work across the western hills, and the cattle were settled in the lower pastures, and the hands had gone in for supper, Peter Yates asked Lillian Carver to marry him. He did not do it on one knee, though the image of him attempting to kneel in the dirt in his good boots made her smile. He did it the way he did everything, directly and with full sincerity, standing on the porch of his house with his hat in his hands, and looking at her with the kind of open, uncomplicated love that a person who had lived honestly long enough eventually produced. He said, "I want to spend the rest of my life on this land with you, not just working alongside each other, though God knows that's something I already wouldn't trade. I want you to be here because this is yours as much as mine, because you belong to it and it belongs to you, and because I love you, Lillian, in the specific and particular way that I think I have been moving toward since I first heard about a woman who stopped a stampede in the dark before dawn and rode across a river to save 3 breaking steers." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had ridden 12 days out of his way to find out if a rumor was true, who had given her time and space and honesty, and a place where her full self was not just tolerated but genuinely wanted. She thought about Thomas, and in the thought she felt his particular goodness, the goodness that had always wanted her to be fully alive. "Yes," she said. Peter Yates' smile was the best thing she had seen in the entire long stretch of plains and sky, and cattle drives and grief and survival that her life had been, and she stood in it the way you stand in sunlight, entirely and without reservation. He put his hat on the porch rail and she stepped toward him, and he took her face gently in his weathered hands and kissed her, and the western hills went gold and then amber, and then the long slow purple of a Kansas July evening, and the crickets started up in the grass, and the horses moved quietly in the barn, and Lillian Carver, who had earned everything she had and lost enough to know the full value of what she was being given, said yes to the rest of her life. They married in October of 1878, 2 months after his proposal, in a ceremony held at the ranch that was attended by Peter's sister Catherine and her husband and their 3 children from Wichita, and by the 4 hands of Cedar Creek who came in their best clothing and stood in a row behind Peter with varying degrees of formality. Hank Delroy in a black coat that had clearly been kept for occasions, and Sam Finley with his hair oiled into an arrangement that would not survive the afternoon wind. Bobby Crane had somehow heard about the wedding from someone in a saloon somewhere on the trail, and had ridden 3 days to attend, arriving the evening before with a gift wrapped in brown paper that turned out to be a fine pair of leather-handled scissors, which was an eccentric choice, but which Lillian received with genuine delight. The minister rode out from Cedar Creek Settlement, a young man named Reverend Aldridge, who was new to the territory and somewhat awed by the scale of the plains and the informality of the gathering, but who performed the ceremony with genuine feeling. Catherine, Peter's sister, cried in the way of women at weddings who are crying with happiness rather than sentiment, and the Finley brothers nudged each other throughout, and Hank Delroy stood with his arms crossed, and his expression fixed in the particular way of a man whose face was not built for public emotion, but whose eyes gave him away entirely. Lillian wore her best dress, a dark green wool that she had brought with her from her last stretch of town life, and that she had let out at the waist and pressed carefully, and she stood in the October light with the hills behind her, and the man she was choosing in front of her, and she felt the full weight of the moment without flinching from it. When Reverend Aldridge said the words that made them husband and wife, Peter took her hand with a care that was not tentative but deliberate, the care of a man who understood the full significance of what he was holding, and he looked at her in a way that said more than words had available to them, and she looked back at him in the same way, and they were married. The celebration that followed was a ranch celebration. Food cooked in quantity, music provided by George Finley, who had a fiddle and played it well, dancing in the open space outside the barn with the autumn stars coming out above and the fire going high and warm, and laughter from Catherine's children who stayed up past their bedtime and fell asleep in the barn hay before midnight. Bobby Crane danced with exuberant incompetence and knocked over a barrel of cider, which became the story of the evening. Davis Worth proved unexpectedly graceful. Hank Delroy did not dance, but stood near the fire with a cup of good whiskey that Peter had obtained for the occasion, and watched everything with the steady approval of a man who had seen his employer earn something he deserved. Lillian danced with Peter, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, moving with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and she let herself be fully in it, fully in the music and the fire and the starlight, and the feeling of being held by someone who knew exactly what they were holding. The first winter at Cedar Creek together was a hard winter by anyone's measure, with snow that came early and stayed, and temperatures that tested the cattle and the fences, and the fortitude of everyone on the property. Lillian and Peter and the hands worked it together, rising before dawn to break ice on the water sources, moving cattle to sheltered ground during the worst of the storms, maintaining the 1,000 small necessities that kept a working ranch alive through a hard season. It was, she thought, the best winter of her life, which said something about the nature of difficulty when it was shared with the right person. They worked together with the ease of people who had figured out each other's rhythms, who could divide the labor without discussion, because they had both developed the instinctive knowledge of what the other was about to do. At night they sat by the fire in the main room of the house and read and talked, and sometimes just sat in the comfortable silence of people who had nothing to prove to each other. And the fire was warm, and the world outside was cold and vast, and the ranch was a kind of contained light in the middle of it all that she had helped build, that was genuinely hers, and the feeling of that was something she had no adequate word for, and so she simply lived inside it. In February, she told him that she was pregnant. He was at the barn when she told him, checking on a mare that had been showing signs of a difficult pregnancy herself, and he turned from the mare and looked at Lillian in the winter light from the barn door, and she watched the news arrive in his face, the way understanding moved through his expression from the information to the meaning, to the full weight of what it meant. He crossed the barn floor and put his arms around her, and she felt the breath go out of him in a long, wordless exhale that contained everything he could not immediately say, and she held onto him and let that be enough. "Are you well?" he said finally, pulling back to look at her face. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I feel fine. Stop looking at me like I'm made of glass." "I'm not looking at you like you're made of glass," he said. "You are a little," she said. "Briefly," he conceded. "I looked at you a little like you were made of glass. I will now stop." She laughed, and he smiled, and the barn was warm with the body heat of horses, and the cold light came through the door, and everything was exactly as it was and exactly as it should be. They told the hands at supper that evening, and the reactions were characteristic. Hank Delry put down his fork and said, with the weight of someone bestowing a genuine benediction, "Good, good, that's good," and picked his fork back up. Davis Worth grinned and said something complimentary in his quick way. The Finley brothers were delighted in the uncomplicated fashion of young men who find uncomplicated things to be delighted about. George Finley said he would play better songs from now on, as if fetal development were sensitive to the quality of fiddle playing, and nobody corrected him because his commitment to the idea was so wholehearted. Peter wrote to his sister Catherine, who wrote back with a letter full of the sort of practical wisdom that only a woman who had had 3 children could provide, and that contained an entire separate section on what to feed the baby and what not to, and a philosophical position on sleep arrangements that she held with a conviction that brooked no disagreement. The spring came late but came truly, the snow going off in stages, the ground softening, the grass beginning its return, and with the spring the regular business of the ranch reasserted itself with all its demands. Lillian worked through her pregnancy with the stubbornness that characterized everything she did, though she and Peter had a considerable and loving argument about the nature of appropriate activity at various stages, an argument she mostly won because she was right, and she could demonstrate being right by pointing to her own functioning body. And he was right to be cautious, and she allowed him the caution because she understood it came from love and not from an assumption that pregnancy was incapacity. She pulled back from the most physically demanding work as the summer advanced, not because she wanted to, but because the practical reality of a pregnancy in its later months on a working ranch required it, and she redirected her energy into the organizational and logistical side of the operation, work she had not previously given as much attention to and which turned out to contain its own satisfactions. She overhauled the record-keeping system, which had been functional but inefficient. She negotiated a better arrangement with the equipment supplier in Cedar Creek Settlement, a conversation that the supplier clearly expected to be perfunctory, and that turned into a 40-minute substantive discussion in which Lillian demonstrated that she knew the market value of everything she was buying to the nearest cent and had 3 competitive offers in hand. The supplier gave her better terms. Peter told this story to every person he met for 2 weeks afterward, which she told him was excessive, and he said he didn't think it was excessive at all. Their son was born on the first day of September, 1879, in the bedroom of the Cedar Creek Ranch house with a midwife from the settlement named Mrs. Holt, who was 60 years old and had overseen more births than she could count, and who approached the whole proceeding with a calm efficiency that Lillian profoundly appreciated. Peter was in the house, near but not in the room, in the way of men of that era who were not permitted proximity at such moments, and who therefore communed with their anxiety in the hallway. The baby was healthy and loud, and had a great deal of dark hair and a look about him, right from the start, of a person who had strong opinions about things and intended to express them. They named him Thomas Peter Yates, Thomas for the man who had shaped the first part of Lillian's life and Peter for the man who had helped her build the second part, and both names sat together in his naming with a rightness that felt complete rather than complicated. Peter came in when Mrs. Holt permitted it and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the particular expression of a man encountering something that is entirely outside the scope of his prior experience, something for which no competence or preparation is sufficient, and in the face of which he is simply overwhelmed in the best possible way. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, as if addressing someone he was meeting for the first time and wanted to make a good impression on. Lillian watched her husband meet his son and felt the full, extraordinary weight of the moment, the way it contained multitudes. The grief for Thomas and the love for this Thomas, the whole long road from Comanche County to this bedroom, the cattle drives and the cold and the sold ranch, and the 14 months of surviving, and the day she had ridden up to Harold Dunn's corral fence with a look that dared him to send her away, and all the days since, the drive and the river crossings and the campfire conversations, and the evening on the eastern boundary when she had said she would stay, and the October night when they had danced under the stars. And now this specific and irreplaceable morning on the 1st of September, with the plains light coming through the window and her husband holding their son for the first time. She was not sorry for anything. The grief for Thomas Carver was part of her and would always be, and she did not need it to be otherwise. But she was here, fully here in this life on this land with this man, and the living of it was the most honest thing she knew how to do. Hank Delray, when he heard the news, came to the house and stood at the door with his hat in his hands and said, "A boy," as if confirming a report. Peter said yes, a boy, healthy and well, and Hank looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up and said, his grandfather would be proud, which was his way of saying what he couldn't say more directly, and Peter's face did something quiet and deep, and he said, "Thank you, Hank," and Hank put his hat back on and returned to the barn, which was exactly the right amount of ceremony for Hank Delray. The years that followed were years of building, the gradual, satisfying kind of building that happens when capable people work good land with genuine purpose. The Cedar Creek Ranch grew, not with the frantic expansion of ambition for its own sake, but with the steady, deliberate growth of an operation that understood what it was doing. Peter and Lillian were partners in every real sense of the word, and anyone who came to the ranch and watched them work for an hour understood immediately that the operation ran the way it ran, because both of them were running it, that her knowledge and instinct and organization, and his deep knowledge of the land and his relationships in the wider community and his unshakable steadiness were complementary in ways that made the whole considerably more than its parts. Davis Worth took on more responsibility as the years passed and became, in practice, the second foreman of the operation, a title and a wage that Peter formalized in the autumn of 1881, when the herd had grown to a size that genuinely required it. The Finley brothers grew into two of the best permanent hands a cattle operation could ask for, Sam in particular developing an instinctive gift with sick animals that made him the closest thing to a veterinary resource that Cedar Creek settlement had. Hank Delray remained Hank Delray, eternal and particular and absolutely irreplaceable. Little Thomas grew into a child who was, from the beginning, clearly his mother's son in temperament and his father's in certain physical qualities, and who combined these inheritances into a personality that was confident and curious and physically fearless in ways that aged both his parents considerably. He could ride before he was 4, which was later than Lillian had managed but considerably earlier than was advisable, and nobody was surprised. In the spring of 1882, Lillian told Peter she was pregnant again. This time he received the news with less initial panic and more immediate joy, though he still looked at her briefly as if she were made of glass before catching himself, and she still told him to stop, and the whole scene repeated itself with a warmth that comes from doing something together a second time and knowing the path. Their second child was a girl born in November of 1882, and she was different from Thomas in every way from the beginning. Where Thomas was loud, she was observant. Where Thomas moved, she was still. And she had Lillian's green eyes and Peter's patient temperament and a quality of watchfulness that, Hank Delray said one afternoon, put him in mind of someone, though he didn't say who, because he didn't need to. They named her Clara after Peter's mother. Clara Yates grew up on Cedar Creek Ranch, understanding in her bones what the land was and what it asked and what it gave back. And she grew up watching her mother work alongside her father as an equal in every sense of the word, not as an unusual thing or a remarkable thing, just as the natural way of her world, which was the best thing Lillian could have built for her daughter. A world in which the full scope of a woman's capability was simply assumed. In the evenings, when the work was done and the hands were in the bunkhouse and the children were in bed and the fire was going in the main room, Peter and Lillian sat together in the way they had sat together for years now, with the ease of people who had become necessary to each other in the deepest and most practical sense. And the plains outside were dark and wide and full of stars, and the ranch was all around them, their thing, built together, theirs. "Are you happy?" Peter asked her once, on one such evening, not from doubt but from the kind of love that wants to hear it confirmed, that never takes for granted what it values. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had watched change and deepen across the years, at the gray that had moved further into his hair, at the familiar amber warmth of his eyes in the firelight. "I'm the most thoroughly happy I have ever been," she said, which was not a small thing for a woman who had built happiness before, lost it, survived the loss, and built it again. He took her hand, the way he did, with the same deliberate care he had used on the day they married, as if he were never going to stop understanding what he was holding. Outside, the Kansas plains ran on in all directions under a sky full of stars, the same sky that had been there when she had ridden a cattle drive in the dust and the rain, and stopped a stampede in the dark, and turned 3 steers in a river, the same sky she had sat under beside a campfire, and heard a man say that she was the best hand on the drive. The same sky that had been there the evening she had said yes to Cedar Creek and yes to this man and yes to the rest of her life. The land held the cattle and the water moved in the creek and the horses stood quietly in the barn and the children slept in their rooms upstairs and the fire burned low and warm, and Lillian Carver Yates held her husband's hand and let the night be exactly what it was, whole and good and hers. A year later, in the summer of 1884, Bobby Crane arrived at Cedar Creek with a new wife of his own, a woman from Caldwell named Rachel who laughed at all of Bobby's stories in a way that suggested she had heard them all before and didn't mind. And they stayed for a week, and it was one of the best weeks the ranch had seen, full of old trail stories and new ones, and the particular warmth of friendship that had been forged in difficult shared conditions, and had only improved with time. Bobby held little Clara and made faces until she laughed, and he told Thomas stories about the cattle drives that Thomas received with the wide-eyed attention of a child who has just discovered that his mother's past is a saga rather than a history. And Lillian sat on the porch and watched Bobby be exactly Bobby, unchanged in essence if somewhat modified by the evident improving influence of Rachel. And she felt the full richness of a life that contained all its previous versions while continuing to accumulate new ones. Peter sat beside her on the porch and watched the same scene, and she felt him beside her the way she felt the ranch itself, as a presence that had become so fundamental to her understanding of the world that its absence would require a wholesale reimagining of the self she was. "He's exactly the same," Peter said, watching Bobby attempt to teach Thomas to whistle with a blade of grass with the focused concentration of a man transmitting essential knowledge. "He's better," Lillian said. "Rachel is good for him." "Good people are good for each other," Peter said, and looked at her when he said it, and she looked back at him with the fullness of everything they had been to each other and everything they were still becoming. The summer went on in its golden, working way, and the ranch grew, and the children grew, and the seasons turned in their reliable cycle of demand and reward, and the two people at the center of it all moved through their days with the particular quality of happiness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the willingness to meet difficulty together, with all of what you are, without reservation. On a morning in the autumn of 1884, Lillian rode the eastern boundary of Cedar Creek alone at sunrise, as she sometimes did, the way she had once ridden the flanks of a cattle herd in the early morning quiet, reading the land and the animals and the quality of the day before the day fully arrived. The hills were golden and the grass was going to its autumn color, and the sky was that deep, saturated blue of a clear fall morning. And Sage, older now, slower, but still her horse, still the same dun color and the same willing temperament, moved at an easy walk along the fence line. And Lillian let her, and watched the hawk that was making its morning circuits over the eastern pasture, and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general. She thought about a woman who had shown up at a corral fence with her late husband's leather chaps, and a look in her eyes that dared a man to send her away. She thought about 11 days of cattle and rain and river crossings, and the particular quality of competence under pressure. She thought about a man on a gray gelding who had ridden beside her along the western flank of a herd one afternoon and said, "I notice things." She thought about what it meant to be built from hard things and to build something good from them, to carry loss and love forward together into a life that was full and genuine and still, after all these years, continually surprising. The ranch was behind her, a quarter-mile west, and she could see the smoke from the kitchen chimney beginning to rise into the still air. And she knew that inside the house Peter would be at breakfast with Thomas and Clara, and that the sound of them together, her husband and her children in the morning kitchen, was one of the best sounds in the world. She turned Sage toward home and rode back across the golden grass in the early light, and the hawk circled overhead in its patient, beautiful way, and the planes ran out in every direction under the deep blue sky, enormous and indifferent and full of the particular kind of grace that belongs to things that were here before us and will be here after. And Lillian Carver Yates rode into the yard of Cedar Creek Ranch and stepped down from the saddle and walked up the porch steps and through the door into the warmth of everything she had earned and everything she had chosen and everything that was hers. "There you are," Peter said, looking up from the table, and the two words held everything that a person could ever hope to hear in the voice of the person they had built a life with. The simple, complete satisfaction of someone who has been waiting not with anxiety, but with the quiet pleasure of anticipation, someone for whom your presence in the room is one of the reliable good things of the world. "Here I am," she said, and took off her hat and sat down at the table between her children in the morning light, and the day began.